Hello, welcome back, my unstoppable friends. I have the lovely Dr. Kristi Angevine back on the podcast. I have already introduced her in the intro, but just briefly, I'm going to have her introduce herself. She came on the podcast back, I think it was episode 30, where we talked about habits, which is her area of expertise. She is a lovely human. She's an OBGYN, and she's the host of the Habits on Purpose podcast, which you have to go listen to. And today we're going to take a deeper dive into a different coaching modality that I think, Kristi, you are an expert in. And I would love to hear your perspectives about it. But before we jump into that, tell us again about you if anyone is new to you, and we're going to get into it.
Yeah, well, it's so fun to be here. I always see these as excuses to connect, and then
100%.
everyone else just gets to sort of listen to what we would naturally jam on, even if we weren't recording.
Yeah.
So thank you for having me. I'm Kristi Angevine, and I'm an OBGYN turned life coach. I love coaching high achievers who have habits like overthinking, overcomplicating, self-doubt, perfectionism, catastrophizing, all the things that I'm my own expert in the past or have been. And I love focusing on habits, particularly what I call hidden habits. So I have my own podcast, as you know, and yeah, that's what I love to do.
I love it. And one of the things that Kristi and I were talking about before she came on the podcast today was we knew actually, even back in episode 30, we need to keep this conversation going. And we touched on some of the topics. I love that you called it hidden habits, but we touched on habits before, and I think we started painting an analogy with the rainforests and creatures, and we had all kinds of crazy analogies. But tell us a little bit about your exploration into coaching, but then how you got into what we're talking about today, which is internal family systems, and why this matters, I think, especially for high achievers to think about their personalities, how they feel about things with that lens.
Okay. I will try to do that piece by piece. So
Yes, I know I asked you a lot just now.
that's good. I think I'll try to remember all three of them and we'll go where we go. So I got into coaching, and because I felt like it gave me a lens to understand myself in a way that I never had before. And the things that really hit home for me were, when we talked about thoughts creating and influencing our feelings, for me, it was the realizing that I had choice about my thoughts that was such a big one. And then learning how to be with my feelings instead of always judging, resisting, or try to fix them. And then probably one of the most amazing parts of sort of applying all the things I learned in coaching to myself was being able to reconnect to my somatic bodily experience, because I sort of lived my life head up with that black box below the neck, right? Neck up, I should say. And when I really got interested in habits, because I did a lot of coaching on over drinking, and a lot of people did not want to be open about the fact that they were seeking a new relationship with alcohol, or a new relationship with food, or a new relationship with habits that felt like they had a life of their own. And so when I realized that over drinking was just a habit, it was sort of an easier way for people to talk about things. And that sort of was the seed that helped my sort of passion for exploring how we form habits and what habits are. And that, we talked about hidden habits.
Mhm.
There are the overt habits of our behaviors, but then there are the hidden habits like second guessing and beating ourselves up that go on under the surface that we might not even notice. So
Mhm.
then fast forward to discovering internal family systems. How sweet that you called me an expert. I have
Yeah.
parts of me that are like, oh, well, I need to tell Priyanka that yes, it's a passion of mine. And there are people
Mhm.
who've studied this for decades since its inception who
Mhm.
I would call the experts. But when it comes to integrating internal family systems with coaching,
Mhm.
I think it's just the best thing ever. And
Yeah.
you asked sort of why it matters. Let me see if I can maybe let me just pass it back
Yeah.
to you, and sort of like
Yeah.
from
Well,
there,
yeah.
you can
Before
ask
you get
me
into before I get into why it matters, I think let me tell you why I call you an expert, because, we follow each other on social media, on Facebook and Instagram, and you have mentioned internal family systems for many months now. Like, I've seen your posts, I follow you. And I think what I think of as an expert is maybe not the traditional definition of an expert. I think of an expert as someone that is deeply passionate about a specific topic and then goes and pursues personal transformation in that field. And then as kind of what you
totally.
touched on, when we experience our own transformation, I feel like we become an expert in our own right, simply because we experienced the transformation. So like what you were saying with over drinking, and for me, it was, weight loss and overeating. I think you and I have both been our own first client in a sense, which is, I think, what makes us experts in what we talk about. So the reason I feel like I call myself an expert in weight loss for high achieving working moms is because that was me. Right. And like with you, I think we get to really talk to us being experts in something because we did the work. And now we get to share a personal perspective of why that matters. So maybe before we get into why internal family systems or IFS matters, how did you even find what is IFS? What is it? Can you maybe define it for us? And how did you even discover it?
Yeah. So I love your definition of expert. Just by the way, for anybody who's listening who
Yeah.
does that thing where like, ooh, but I'm not the expert.
Yeah.
And I definitely identify with feeling like an expert when it comes to applying things from internal family systems through basically two habits into my clients and
Mhm.
myself. So I love how you describe that. So internal family systems is a modality in psychotherapy that was created by Dick Schwartz, and it came out of all of his research when he was doing therapy with a lot of youth who had eating disorders,
Mm,
particularly bulimia.
mm,
And he was trying to use his lens of a family therapist to help them. And, in family therapy, the paradigm is, well, you can't fix the kid. You need to look at the entire family and understand the entire it's sort of the context. You can't just tell the kid to eat differently if they've got an over controlling authoritarian parent or a
mm,
sibling who is bullying them. You have to look at the entire thing. And when
mm,
he tries to use the tenets from that to a lot of his youth who were, constantly binging and purging, he found it just didn't work. It wasn't
mhm,
complete. And they started talking in this language that he and ultimately referred to as parts. They would say things like, well, there's a part of me that something happens in my life, and then this critical part comes in and just tells me I did a horrible job and so worthless. And then to the rescue comes this part that says, well, just, you can just bury yourself in food and you can escape and you'll feel so much better. And then as soon as I do, my critic comes back and this part tells me I'm such a loser, I'm awful. And he recognized that these were different parts. And these different parts, instead of just being all the conflicting thoughts we have in our head, where they ping pong from, the one part of us says this and the other part of us says this. He said, no, these are actually distinct sub personalities and entities. And if we treat them as such, we can get to know ourselves better.
mm. So like, I love the idea of parts. And what's coming up for me is how so many, and I feel like this was me and probably so many of our clients, is the conflict that we experience between our parts. So there's a part of me that
Yes.
wants to hit a goal, but then there's this other part of me that really wants this immediate gratification. Or there's a part of me that wants to criticize my work, but there's a part of me that wants to be compassionate and curious. So like before we get into, because I feel like there's a perpetual struggle there until we maybe unpack this, but before we get to how to unpack it, what is it that you think lets some parts have a louder voice versus other parts of us? Because I feel like that's what then drives our behavior, right? When one part kind of starts to take over, for lack of a better phrase. But how would you say, like, what leads for some parts to take over versus other parts?
Yeah. So the idea with parts is that all of our parts have a positive intent. So in general, they are doing whatever their role is, like offering criticism or offering escape or offering setting a goal, because they are either trying to protect you from, experiencing something else, or they are trying to help you adapt in a way that keeps sort of your whole system in equilibrium. The idea is that if there's homeostasis, if there's inner safety, if there's a sense of security, all is well. So some of these parts, their job is to make sure that you don't feel flooded by powerlessness, helplessness, shame, these more tender parts of us.
Mm,
And they're kind of like the image that I come to that brings that I love telling people about is there's a picture on the internet somewhere. It says huge, massive dog. And it's sitting next to this teeny tiny baby on a picnic blanket in the sun. And we can think of parts as the teeny tiny baby is the part that if it is activated, it will scream, it will yell, we will be completely flooded with all these really awful emotions.
mm,
And the big dog is sort of like the other parts that are like, listen, if I can criticize you enough so that you don't activate my deep shame, I've done my job. So
mm,
sometimes parts can come up and be really loud simply because they're doing their job to protect or help you adapt in some way. And whichever part can be the loudest in the moment, it's just the part that will. And parts are complex, like just like you think about like external family dynamics, like you go to, I don't know, a holiday dinner and there's all sorts of complexity that, the outside observer might not appreciate. Same thing happens internally. Parts have dynamics, like we talked about the sort of disordered eating, parts where there's the critic that comes in and then the, what we call like the firefighter that swoops in to douse out the flames with food. There's polarities and they like sometimes don't like each other. And sometimes they have that, which you said so nicely, that conflict where we have one saying something, another saying something, and they go back and forth in ways that can leave us feeling torn. We're just feeling like we don't really know what we think. Like, what's the actual truth when we have all these different ones?
Yeah. And I think, I like that you're referring to it as complex because, sometimes I think that we think logically we understand this very logically. We can say like, yes, okay, I have the critic, or yes, I have that compassionate voice in my mind. And I think that sometimes there's a confusion as to, okay, I understand it logically. Why can't I activate my compassionate voice on purpose? But I think what you're bringing up is that there is complexity and layers. It's like layers of an onion. There's layers in understanding our parts, just like any human. Like when you go to a holiday dinner, there are layers in understanding the human across the table from you. So I think that, the part that I find to be the most fascinating in this is how even the critic is meant to protect you. And I think this is hard, even when I tell my clients every single time they overeat, I'm like, that was the best decision you made. And they're like, what are you talking about? They want to fight me on this. And I think that, maybe we can speak to this a little bit, but that moment when you make a decision to eat when you're not hungry, or to overeat, or to overdrink, or to overthink, was your brain's in that moment. And we're not talking about in retrospect, because in retrospect, it's a whole different ballgame. But in the moment, it was your best decision at the time. And
100%.
if we can understand why it was the best decision at the time, that's when we can unravel what might different, how we might want to change it moving forward. But can you speak a little bit to like that piece, how certain parts, they start to become louder, maybe the critic or the overeater or the overdrinker or the overthinker? How is it that we can start to really hear that, okay, this voice is taking over? And like, how do we start navigating that experience?
Yeah. So I think it's so important for your listeners to just really hear what you just said, that there will be times where a part of us will drive us to take an action that in retrospect, another part of us has thoughts about. So when you say like, my clients want to fight me on saying, hey, that was the best decision you could have made, there's a part of them that doesn't like the other part's actions, right? So
Right.
it's sort of like in retrospect, that logical part that's like, well, but I know better. And I made a plan and I said I would follow through and I would allow my urges and I would do all these things. And that's the right thing. And that's for my future.
Yeah.
That part has a lot to say about the
Yeah.
part that in the moment made the actually best decision that was available at the time. So in
Yeah.
terms of, so first off, just sort of recognizing that if you conceptualize the everything that's going on in your mind and body as a multiplicity, like to get back to the, the ecosystem, rainforest
Yeah.
analogy we used before, but if it's a multiplicity, you can think about it sort of like if every part were, and I like to use like the idea of a bunch of kindergartners, not to infantilize our parts, but just be like, there's a bunch of kids and all of them have different agendas. And sometimes some of them are kind of loud. Then there's the kindergarten teacher who is sort of the leader of the system, who's like, I recognize so-and-so's being super loud. And I recognize this one doesn't like that one. When you think about it like that, if you have a part that's being really loud, let's just say there's a part that's like, screw it. I don't care. I'm eating this right now. I deserve it. I just want it. One won't hurt. No problem. That, like plan from yesterday is the dumbest thing ever. I'll figure it out. When that part comes on board, you will have a certain bodily experience of it, whether it is desire or ambivalence or whatever it is. Anytime you're feeling an emotion or you're hearing lots of thoughts that seem like they have an agenda, and the emotion is anything other than just really open curiosity, warmth, clarity, anything where we just be like, hey, that just feels like just me in my best state. If it's anything else, you can say, oh, this is a part. And sometimes just, I call it the 3 N's, just noticing that, naming it and normalizing it. So notice, name, normalize That's how you can, what we call sort of differentiate yourself or unblend from a part. So there's a part that's like, let's just eat. When you
Mm-hmm.
notice that, you go, oh, there's a part of me that right now wants to go against my plan from yesterday. And you might also notice at the same time, there's a part of me that's telling me that's the worst decision ever. What's your problem? Ooh, that doesn't feel so good. Oh, there's like a bunch of kindergartners or people talking to
Mm-hmm.
me at once. No wonder I want to go eat this food because it's kind of will make it all be quiet if I just go eat. Okay. And
Mm-hmm.
when you can notice it and then be like, this is a part and unblend, as we call it, where you just go, huh, that's what's here right now. I wonder why that's here. That's when the parts kind of get a little quieter and you can actually listen to them individually.
Mm. I really love that. I think, what's coming to mind is I I know that sometimes when we talk about just becoming aware of what you're thinking, I think that's kind of what you're referring to, like becoming aware of the voice, noticing it. Oh, like, oh, this is a part of me that's just having an opinion. I think sometimes, and I know that I've done this, sometimes it's like, that can't be it. That can't be enough. But it really is like observing your thoughts. It's, the observer effect is like an actual phenomenon where when you observe yourself, you fundamentally change it. And I think that sometimes we, especially high achievers, want to move right to like, what do I do? We want the strategic action plan. And I know because I've done it plenty. It's like, tell me the steps 1, 2, and 3. Tell me the steps that I can tangibly take. But what that is implying is that just observing yourself and catching yourself in these thoughts and finding those parts is not powerful on its own. And I am curious did you ever experience that when you first discovered coaching and even IFS, like just becoming aware of my thoughts isn't enough? Like I need what are the next tangible steps
Oh,
versus
yeah.
like what we're talking about? It's like, no, it's incredibly powerful when you actually just super become aware.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of pieces to this that are super important. And that number one is just acknowledging like you and I, and probably all the listeners here, probably have very strong fix it, figure it out parts that are logical, very intellectual, that are like, let's get shit done. Like,
Mhm.
awesome, good, check, aware, and let's move on and do the things. And the doing is how I create the results. And those parts probably don't quite understand that the awareness is actually essential. Without the time spent with the awareness, all the doing kind of misses some of the pieces, right? That's sort of like if I make a checklist for myself, but the whole time I'm being mean to myself while I do my checklist, at the end of the day, some stuff will be done and I will still feel awful, right? So the awareness is actually absolutely fundamental. And and sometimes we just don't know what that means though. Like we don't know,
Right.
like, so great, I'm aware of some thoughts. Now
Right.
what? And in the
Right.
now
Right.
what, instead of going to, okay, give me the things to do, it's like,
Mhm.
okay, when I'm really aware, this is how I think the kindergarten thing is really helpful. If there's thoughts and we're aware of them, being aware of like a little kid who comes up and tells you some things and be like, yeah, I see you. Okay, what do I need to do? Is one thing.
Mhm.
But if we say, oh, I hear these are the thoughts you're having, makes so much sense you're having those thoughts. They're there for a good reason. Your perspective is totally welcome here. There's probably some motivation at the core of why you're doing what you're doing. I don't really know what it is, but I'd be
Mhm.
so interested to find out where you're coming from. That feels totally different, right? Like when we
Mhm.
feel, that feeling of feeling really
Absolutely.
seen and held and
Right.
understood.
Mm.
When our parts feel seen and held and understood and validated,
Mm.
then they usually soften. And
Mhm.
then they don't feel so basically, if we say, yeah, inner critical thoughts, okay, moving on, and then we go do stuff, that part of us that offered those things, it knows that we're just being superficial and we're like, sort of like, yeah, I'm so curious, like, why are you doing what you're doing? So if I like pretend to listen, then maybe you'll go away. They just come back with a vengeance later. They kind of like get
Mhm.
louder, like
Yeah.
kindergartners would. They just are like,
Yeah.
let
They
me
don't feel
increase the
heard. It's
intensity. They
like
don't feel
they
heard.
can,
So they,
and I've shared on this before. So like I just want to touch on 2 points. One is I think especially high achieving working moms are masterful doers. Like this is a ninja skill you have, and I think it's a superpower. If you are listening to this and you're a working mom, it's a ninja skill you have, and also it makes a lot of sense that you rely on doing because it is a ninja skill. It has probably gotten you very far in your work life or in your mom life, or maybe balancing both. And I think that the best example, I recently had a podcast episode on my son and disappointment and piano. And I was sharing this example where I used to take piano lessons, and, my parents would be like, okay, sit on the piano. And so the action would be for me to sit on the piano for, however many, 30 minutes and practice the piano. So I was doing the action, but I wasn't actually there. Like, I didn't want to be there. I didn't like being there. I felt forced to be there. I felt like I wasn't being heard. It felt like I could be physically doing the action, but totally disconnected from the activity. And I think the reason I like to give that example is we think that our results, becoming a better piano player or stop overeating, stop over drinking, stop ruminating, is going to come from the action of not doing something or doing something. But what we're talking about is it's really going to come from you connecting with the part of you that wants to or not wants to do something. It's like, I keep thinking, like, I could have sat at the piano for who knows how many hours. I would never have become a better piano player ever, because I was so not wanting to be there. And I wonder, like, if I had connected with the instrument or understood why I don't want to be there and really explored that more, whether that would have shifted something for me. But I'm curious what you think about that, because I think high achievers especially really want to do, simply because it is their area of expertise. That's where we think results come from, because you and I both know, as physicians, as OBGYNs, listen, results come from doing, right? Especially procedurally. And I think what we're talking about is really a departure from that, specifically for high achievers.
Yeah. So I think there's the fact that your listeners they have this as a super skill and this is a strength. We just want to honor that that's actually an extremely effective skill to have. Without that skill, there are some things that are going to be much more difficult. And that skill works in certain contexts and is a beautiful match for certain jobs, right? So you and I are at the hospital and there's an emergency C-section. We're not going to just be like, well, let me understand what's going on in my mind. We're going to move into action together, right?
Yeah.
We'll divide and conquer. Even if you and I are the only two people on the planet, we're going to get that shit taken care of, right? We're gonna act.
Yeah.
So
can you imagine, though, in that moment, it's like there's an emergency and it's like, let's just pause and listen to how we feel. That's not what we're talking about.
Right. So, yeah. And this isn't to, and, in that same vein, neither of us are suggesting that being able to do things to create results is a problem that you should fix or change. No, keep doing it. There's probably, like, the way I would put it is, there are parts of us that are really, really good about multitasking, getting things done. And those parts are great. We get to love those parts of us. We're like, yes, good. Like, I get to, like, I've sort of like, that's my consultant who takes care of things when there's 17 things to do. And, like, we're going to the amusement park on vacation and got to make sure I remember all the awesome. Let that part be activated.
Yes.
And also, since that's not how we live our lives always, we're not always doing. The piano analogy is gorgeous for this. Anytime you notice that desire to go do things that has an urgent quality to it, sort of like, it's not just a matter of fact, this is what we do. This is how we get out of the house. We're going to do 17 things in about 30 seconds. And this is what I'm going to do. When it's got I don't know, just a sense of, like, if some people could see me here, I'm like making these funny gestures. I'm like trying to convey this, like, sense of, like, got to get this done. Whenever it's that's when we get to get curious about, like, why there's such a tension or a pressure or a stress or an anxiety driving the desire to do. Because usually that's a part that's like, I don't know what else to do, so I'm going to do this thing that I've done so much that has worked in these other situations, which is beautiful.
Right.
But in cases where you're trying to look at sort of the reasons why you might eat more than you want, or the reasons why you might ruminate, or reasons why you might beat yourself up, doing isn't going to be the answer so much as understanding.
Yes. And I want to just actually even go back to that emergency C-section example. I actually think about, like, I imagine the new attending. If you're a resident that recently graduated and maybe you're a brand new attending and it's your first emergency where you are the attending in charge, this actually does apply to you. So I know I was laughing earlier about, like, you're not going to pause and look at your feelings when you're, like, in the middle of, saving a patient. But I actually want you to think about, in that moment, what is the experience, not even of just a new attending, but even a seasoned attending, when there's an emergency that's about to happen. Because we're human, we're going to have an emotional response. Maybe there is going to be some fear or worry. You want to make sure you make the best, most strategic choices and decisions in line and service of the patient. And I think what we're talking about is in that moment, what I think high achievers especially do is we kind of bulldoze past that experience because we think we have to be quote unquote strong. We have to be very powerful. We have to be authoritative. And I think what you're referring to is just taking like 5 seconds to recognize and validate if you do feel fear, worry, nervous, whatever that voice is right before you go to the OR, right before you pick up the scalpel. It's like, I hear you. You're nervous because you care about this. I hear you. And it's like just normalizing that experience allows you to stop bulldozing over your normal human experience. And I wanted to share that specifically because I see in the Facebook groups, if you're in any of these Facebook groups, I am in like these physician moms, OBGYN mom Facebook groups, and I can see how so many physicians, they care so much about doing a good job. They care so much about their patients, about like over delivering to, their practices and their hospitals, and they do it at the expense of themselves. They start burning out. And I feel like this is one of the reasons, because they're not, using the 3 N's when they're having a normal human experience, when they're doing something really hard or really big. So I kind of want to just highlight that, because I know we were just kind of like, oh no, like you're not going to sit there and pause, but like actually kind of maybe you could.
Yes.
What do you think?
So,
yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I love that. Like, because we're not going to stop and spend 10 minutes and journal and call a friend. We're still going to be moving towards getting things done. But sort of that more advanced skill is recognizing that, yes, as a human, I am going to have all these, thoughts and feelings come up. And I like to think about it as like in those, like a micro pause where 5 seconds, you can do like an internal roll call. So you're taking attendance and inventory of like, who's here? Oh, there's the part of me that is super scared that this could go wrong and doesn't want it to be there. There's a part of me that deeply cares. There's a part of me that's worried about like the interaction I'm going to have with that relative, that like things were kind of like, oh, okay, I noticed like all these, like picture them as like a little mouse pops on your shoulder. You got a bunch of them. They're all like here. And you can be like, go away. I don't want to have anything to do with you. You need to go away so I can focus. Or you can be like, I noticed they're all here. Amazing. Trust me, I've got this. And any parts that you notice, like in those micro moments, being like, I notice there's fear. I notice there's annoyance at that relative. I notice there's hopefulness this will go okay. I notice all of a sudden, I just remembered that case that was really difficult. Okay, I notice all those. And you can sort of tell yourself internally, like, okay, so for now, I'm going to focus on the task at hand because this is what, we got business to tend to, and we've got about 10 seconds before we've got to go. And if in the aftermath, I notice any of my parts need some attention, you've got it. Promise I'll be there. And then you follow through on your promise. It's sort of like telling, a young kid, I promise I will listen to you. Once we leave the grocery store, we'll sit and have a talk about these big emotions. For now, because there's people waiting in line, we're going to have to just wait. But I promise I'll be back and we'll touch base later. So there's
and you
just
have to follow through.
You have to follow through. And then you just then after the C-section's over and you go, wow, that was super intense. That anxiety I had when I was remembering that old case. Okay, what's going on there? What do you need? What's happening? And it's just that sort of like super kind and curious and like, yeah, I'm going to follow through. I said I would be back. Here I am. Where it creates sort of a trust. And that's the part of internal family systems that I think is really important to note is they don't posit that there's just a bunch of parts, that we're just running around just a bunch of like this multiple personality, chaos. They're like, there's all these parts that have developed for good reasons. They all have positive intent. They all matter. Yeah. And some of them carry these burdens. And because of that, they are in roles that they may not love. They don't realize that they don't have to be in. And sort of at the center or at the hub is the you that's not a part. It's the sturdy leader of the system, the one who's like, yes, I see all my parts. And I'm here with compassion and confidence and curiosity and clarity to sort of be the one to sort of facilitate and coordinate all my beautiful parts.
And, right when you just said that, like, some of those parts are carrying a really heavy burden. Like, I just was like, oh, little kindergartner carrying this like heavy burden. And, what, at least I know for me is like, I used to feel really annoyed when I would have some of those bigger emotions like annoyance, frustration, anger, irritation, definitely urges to like eat in the middle of the night or like the nachos or the glass of wine. And I think that when you paint the picture in that way, that those parts are carrying a heavy burden and they like may not even want to be carrying the burden, all of a sudden I kind of feel this resistance drop. And I'm like, oh, like I can almost have a little bit of compassion for
Totally.
that part. And I imagine with your kindergarten classroom example, like when we can have some compassion for that kid that is acting up, acting out, kind of maybe even disrupting like the ecosystem of the class because they're being so loud, when we can have compassion for that voice, I just imagine if we could pause in that moment and see that this little part is carrying this burden, how recognizing just that allows the kid to put the burden down. Like maybe they don't have to try so hard to get my attention anymore because
Yeah.
I'm what you were saying, like I'm going to come back. I promise I'm going to hear what you have to say. It's like maybe they don't have to try so hard. And
Yeah.
I wonder for you what you think about this in your experience coaching on using IFS. Like, do you feel like the fatigue that high achievers experience is because they're fighting these parts? And I wonder like what you think about that. I'm like, I
Yeah.
know I'm like taking a
I think
detour,
that's
but that's where
no, no.
my brain went.
Oh, I don't think it's a detour at all. I think it's beautiful. It makes perfect sense. Um, I think that's a great way to put it. That when there are parts battling each other, it can feel exhausting, right? Like just sort of like because you mentioned so you're like nicely that, if there's parts of you that feel super annoyed or super irritated or super frustrated or super whatever, you can on top of that get really annoyed with the parts of you that like, what is my problem that I'm being so snippy with my kid? Like, why did that?
Right.
So then we can have, you know, parts of us that like just don't like each other. And so we're constantly left to be like feeling criticized and then criticizing ourselves and then criticizing that. And they talk about this for like in couples, like in dynamics. They'll say that
Mm,
most of the conflict that happens in interpersonal, intimate relationships are what we would call parts wars. So
mm,
a part of me comes out that maybe my partner has a part that doesn't like that part. And
mm,
so when our parts are sort of like,
mhm,
interacting, it's different than when like I'm actually, and this is a little bit of the detour, like when I can recognize that there's a part of me that's really activated. And when I'm in the part where I'm really anxious and snippy and like looking at the time, I'm
mhm,
like, come on, everybody, stop. What are you dilly dallying? I told you. But when I
mhm.
can recognize that that part's there, then I can say, hey guys, there's a part of me that's really focused on the time. And this part is really worried that if we don't do what we said we were going to do, that we are going to deal with the stuff that we said we didn't want to deal with. And so I noticed this part really is getting loud and wants you to know
Mm,
that I'm concerned that we're like getting off track.
mm,
And so when we can talk for our parts, like
mhm.
to ourselves too, or to other people, it makes it so much more open in terms of understanding things.
Yeah. And I think that what always comes up for me, especially this is, I think, a big piece of coaching too, is a lot of times when I think clients come to work with us, they want to achieve a result. So like weight loss, or they want to change a specific habit. But what they really also want, especially for high achievers, is they want to feel more calm in their mind. What they really want
Exactly.
is the calm in their mind, or they want to feel a certain way. And I think what we're talking about is this is the avenue to feel better. When you stop
Yeah.
like having the struggle with those parts and like recognize that those parts are holding a heavy burden, they came around for a reason and we've been fighting them. I think that that's also probably a piece of it. Like we didn't know we were fighting them. We didn't
Exactly.
recognize that these were parts to begin with, but
Yeah.
like actually recognizing that these are parts that have been holding a burden. I just keep thinking about that working mom that feels so tired at the end of the day because she's been fighting all day. And I don't just mean like fighting with her
Absolutely.
to-do list or fighting with her kids or fighting with her partner, but she's been like having this internal fight of
Yeah.
how much she wants to do and how was the second guessing and the ruminating. And that's the part that I think creates real fatigue, right? And takes us
Totally.
out of our
Absolutely.
badass
Yeah.
ninja-ness, is that piece. And what if we could solve that simply with this?
Yeah. No, and that, that movie for, your listeners who don't know tons about IFS, which, because it's kind of a new thing. One of the ways that they teach it is they say, hey, remember that animated feature called Inside Out,
Mhm,
where, the girl has all the different characters in her mind. That's a beautiful representation of exactly what they're talking about. And so if you imagine you've got 10 different cartoon characters that are
mhm,
running around arguing with one another and saying like, well, you shouldn't do this, constantly going on as you go through your day, when you finally sit down and have a moment to yourself, it's not serene and quiet. It's just
Mhm.
still more of the same. And that
Right.
struggle is the exhausting part. It's,
Yeah.
it's actually not all the stuff that we do during the day. It's what we're thinking and feeling as we do it, what parts are present, what parts are battling as we're doing all those things, which is why we can lose the weight or get a different job or do
Yeah.
all the things and still, sit at the piano for 30 minutes a day. And
Yeah.
at the end, not have that sense of either presence or calm or connection
That's right.
internally and wonder like, wait, but I did all the things.
Right. And I think I love that you brought that up. Like you can take all of the actions and lose the weight or stop drinking, or, you can like find a result, but I don't think it will be permanent, forever, ever permanent with ease if you don't do this piece. And I'm curious, like, the other thought that I just had was like, when you really start to recognize those parts and validate them and hear what they have to say, I think also it changes the dynamic of the whole classroom. Like it changes the whole system, right? So it's speaking of like ecosystems, when one piece changes, it's like the whole entire system starts to change.
Yeah,
I'm imagining like, in the kindergarten classroom when that one kid who's being really loud and taking over, when we give that one kid a little bit of attention and recognition and like, listen, I'm listening to you, how the dynamic of the whole entire classroom will start to change. And to me,
totally.
that is what the whole point of this is. Like, it's not just about the one kid. And I think that, if you're someone that's like, but I don't know if I want to like spend a lot of time on my anger or spend a lot of time on my frustration, I'm like, this is not just about the one part. This is actually giving all the other parts more of what they deserve. If you solve this one part, you give them all more. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I love that because if you think about, the kids in the classroom, if all of them feel seen and heard, and they also know that if they're having a hard day, that they will be seen, heard, somebody will be willing to listen to where they're coming from,
Mm.
then the dynamic does change so much. And in understanding sort of one aspect of things, we're sort of sending the global message to our entire system. Hey, every single one of you in here matters. Like all the thoughts, all the emotions, you all matter. I can't interact with all of you at the same time, right? Like I can only one at a time. But once every part of us knows, oh, she's going to listen to the part that's really angry right now and understand their perspective. She's also going to do the same with me. That makes sometimes like if there's a critic that's like doesn't like when we maybe go off of our plan with eating or something, if the critic sees you talking to the part that really floods you and makes you, eat and you can't stop and you're like, what just happened? If the critic sees you understanding that part, then it's almost like the critic's job doesn't have to be so difficult because this part, the kid's not being so loud anymore. So the part that criticizes doesn't have to be so on guard. And so
Mhm.
then they all is like a nice ripple effect where they're like, oh, okay.
Yeah. I also like, I can imagine somebody listening to this is like, that sounds like a lot of work. I don't want to be a kindergarten teacher handling all the 5-year-olds. It sounds exhausting. This sounds like a lot of work. Like, listening to one part at a time. Like, I can
Yeah, it's
imagine somebody
actually,
listening to this being like, this sounds like way too much. You know what? Like, this is too much.
you're
I have
like,
too much going on for me to
peace
do
out,
this.
not going to
Yeah,
do
I'm
this.
kind
Yeah.
of done. So what would you say to somebody
Yeah.
that's like, this sounds like way too much work to do? Like,
It,
no.
the actual difficult thing is not doing this work. It's so
Yeah.
much easier
Hmm.
when you just do it. Yes. Does it
Yeah.
take overcoming some entropy and some disinterest and some like, I don't know if I've got time for this? Absolutely, which is
Yeah.
totally reasonable. So
Yeah.
so what you just described, it's like that's another part. There's a part that's like,
Right.
I don't have time for this. Like TikTok people, we got things
Right.
to do. Right. And that's
Right.
probably connected to the part that
Mhm.
knows that you got to be efficient about things. You don't want to like take all
Yeah.
day. So
Yeah.
it's reasonable to have that concern.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, once you do, once you do slow down and spend a little time, then actually it's not so hard. And then you don't have to struggle so much. Just sort of
Right.
like, and if you, instead of losing your keys every time, and maybe a silly example, if you take some time to be like, okay, where's the best place for me to put my keys? And how can I put them there every single time? And how can I make sure and maybe get my kids to help me remember, hey, mom, did you put your keys in the spot?
Mm.
That's going to take some effort. And
Mm.
yet, once you develop just that routine of your keys go here, the time savings is huge because you're not spending 25 minutes running around the house like a crazy person trying to find your keys and getting mad
Right.
every week.
Yes, that's so good. And I think that for anyone that's listening, any high achiever, especially, I think that it's really normal and common. Again, like, as you said, it's a part of us, like the part is like, let's go, let's go, let's go. We have so much to do, is to actually do solid inventory. When you keep that part and you let that part keep driving, what's the lifetime impact of keeping that thought, keeping that part of you driving in the driver's seat, having the loudest voice in the classroom? And the image I have is like you're constantly putting out fires everywhere you go. It's like a constant rush. We could keep that, right? We're not going to snatch it away. I want you could keep it. But if you can recognize the gravity of, like, there's a cost to your lived experience if you keep that, I think that's when it's like, okay, it might be worth the investment of my time to slow down for a few minutes and actually figure this out. It's an investment because it starts to save you time down the road. It's like having the disorganized classroom,
Yes.
and the teacher's like, I don't have time to figure this out. And then, like, she just has a disorganized, crazy classroom forever, rather than doing the work at the start to get organized and then have a much calmer experience with her classroom moving forward.
Totally. And the thing that crosses my mind here that I think is really important to share is that, so number one, if you hear all this stuff about, coaching internal family systems and you don't know what to do next because you're like, but this sounds so interesting.
Yeah.
That's when you go do some reading,
Mm-hmm.
find a therapist or a coach or somebody who specializes in, the things like you do, or the things like I do, and learn more to get help, because
Mm-hmm.
there's interesting things that you can do that are super practical. But the thing that I wanted to mention is that oftentimes, like with the part of us that's like, let's go, 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 let's get all this stuff done. When you actually connect with that part, and like imagine like you're going out to a coffee date, but
Mm-hmm.
it's with this part and you're like actually communicating with this part and having a dialogue with it. What if you ask this part, like, okay, what are you afraid would happen if we didn't go, 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 go? You'll find out that behind that is something else. Like we don't know what it is it's different for everybody, but a part might say, well, I'm just worried you're not going to get all the things done. And then you're going to feel like a failure. And then you're going to just deteriorate into massive depression and be a terrible mom.
Mm-hmm.
And so you go, oh, okay. So no wonder you're so active. Okay. Makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. And then when you can ask that part, like how it likes its job, oftentimes these parts that are these go, go, go parts, they'll be like, what do you mean like my job? Like, I
I
don't like my
know.
job, but it's essential I do it. And then when
Like
you
those
can sort
sweet
of
little
plant
parts, like those
sweet little
sweet little guys,
parts, right?
like, oh, you,
They are,
like, this little
they're
puppy that
so,
I'm hating on. Like, I'm literally imagining this little 5-year-old with this super, those little kids with those huge backpacks, and they're like
yes.
little people and look like they're going to topple over. I'm just
Yeah,
imagining like a little 5-year-old holding this huge backpack with all these weights. And it's like, you think I like this? I don't
exactly.
like this. I feel like I have to do this for you. Oh, yeah.
Right. But they
Yeah.
don't know any other way, right? The little
Yeah.
kid's backpack like is like told like you drop that backpack and everything's going to go to like this abysmal catastrophe. So the kid's like, I'll do it as long as I have to. But when you can sort of plant
Right.
that seed of hope and be like, hey, if it were possible to make sure that like, catastrophes didn't happen,
Mm-hmm.
but you didn't have to do this particular job, is there something
Mm-hmm.
else you might want to do? Almost invariably, these parts are like, absolutely. They either want a vacation, they want to go to the roller skating rink, they want to become your best cheerleader, they want to be like, they
Mm-hmm.
want some other role. They're just like, yeah, because their intrinsic sort of strengths they're drawing on. But
Mm-hmm.
when they're holding that big backpack, they don't actually have the freedom to
Yeah.
do what they would actually like, what they're meant to do, which might be
Oh,
something
yeah.
totally different than their role they've got right now.
Yeah. Oh, like, and, just using this little kid backpack as an example, it's like no kid wants to hold the 100-pound backpack.
Yeah.
I think that, I want to say that just because it's like, I think we assume that there's a part of us that wants that role, that wants to criticize us, that wants to um, push us, that wants to overeat, overdrink, overthink. We think that that part of us like just wants it inherently. And that there's something inherent about you that is like unique, that just can't change this. But actually what we're kind of highlighting is that part of us doesn't actually even want their role. Like,
Yeah.
like,
It's
what if we
sort
could
of
be like,
like
give it
it,
permission? Like, oh, you don't even want the role of the heavy backpack.
yeah, it's in like in sort of family therapy, they would call this a parentified child. Like a
Mm,
part of us that at a young age took on a role because it was the best it could do at that time.
mm,
And it might seem like a grown-up, very like sophisticated role. And
Right.
yet sort of when you get to the heart of it, it's like, oh, this part of me has been doing this for a long time. Maybe since I
Yeah.
was 12 or maybe since I was 2.
Even
And
younger.
so
Yeah.
usually it's a young part, right? It's a young
Yeah.
part of us who's taken on a role that's
Hmm.
holding a burden, doing a
Yeah.
job, doing its best, because
Absolutely.
it's didn't know any other way.
And, I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, but I think sometimes it can feel disconcerting or even scary if this has been a part of you for a long time, particularly this little child is holding this heavy backpack. It feels disconcerting and maybe scary to put the backpack down because it's been holding it for so
100%.
long. It's so
Yeah.
familiar, it's so practiced that the idea of putting it down, like, it feels like your safety is under threat. And I
Yeah.
think that that's an important piece. Like what we're talking about today is planting a seed for anyone that's listening. We're planting a seed at the idea, the possibility that there are parts of you that, you know, are carrying a heavy burden that don't want to. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on creating safety for those parts to put the backpack down. Like, how can somebody
Yeah.
do that? Because I know, at least for me, my experience is when it's unfamiliar, it's like, ooh, like let's just maybe hold on to the backpack, especially if it's for decades, like decades old.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is why it can be really important to do this in community or with somebody who can
Mhm.
guide you through this because like doing like solo IFS or self-coaching can be a little bit unnerving,
Yeah.
but the basics can be that is any way that you can create or source internal safety for yourself.
Mhm.
Those things like any sort of self-regulation techniques, like, okay,
Mhm.
it feels unnerving to set down this, like practice of criticizing myself. I
Mhm.
don't know any other way. Of course it does. Okay, so let me do some box breathing and remind myself that even though it's familiar and even though it feels so like horribly like my skin's being peeled off and this is really risky, the actual truth is,
Mhm.
and that type of talking to ourselves, like the truth
Right.
is there may be a different way that might not
Yeah.
be as scary as I think. And if
Yeah.
I can open up to that possibility, from a place of knowing that like, well, even if I tried out this different way and it didn't work out, okay, I can always go back to that. It can
Mhm.
be very soft and very gentle. Sort of like, and
Mhm.
again, like you're talking to somebody who's really scared and nervous, you talk to yourself in that way.
Right.
And you really prioritize creating that safety for all of your parts because it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, like you said, of course, like why would you want to put down something that's been like it's been working? You haven't
Yeah.
died. It's
Yeah.
worked for 30 to
Yeah.
40 or 50 years. Of
Yeah.
course it feels a little bit terrible.
Right.
That's
I almost
to
imagine like the
suggest
way
a
that
real
you
change.
described it is like you're talking to another part that's like holding hands, like fear or, worry is holding hands with this part that maybe you're trying to unpack and unravel. And it's like trying to protect that other part, right? So now we have these two parts,
Yes.
they're like little besties holding hands and they both are carrying
Yes.
100-pound weights. And it's almost like telling, the part that is feeling afraid or feeling worried, like, listen, I know you're worried about your friend putting down her backpack, but I want you to know she's totally okay. Like, let's look around. Let's like really show both parts that it's actually safe to do it. And don't force yourself. I think that again, the purpose of this episode is just to plant seeds of possibility, plant seeds of awareness where it's like I think high achievers can just know if they have been feeling the struggle, if they feel this fatigue of this constant battle in their mind, that it's okay. And also there's a pathway forward, which
Yeah.
is kind of what you've been highlighting this whole episode.
Yeah. No, the idea is to be like a merchant of hope for our system, to be like, there
Mhm.
is a different way.
Mhm.
And yes, it's unfamiliar. And like
Mhm.
that makes sense. And that idea of just sort of like almost like globally validating
Mhm.
that any part of us that has objections to things, like even that makes sense. Like the little bestie, it makes
Yeah.
sense that she shows up to be like, what? I don't think so. It's like,
Yeah.
and when we can get those parts to trust us, the us with a capital U or the, self with a capital S, as they would call it, when
Yeah.
they can trust us and they know that they can set the backpack down and the whole system's not going to collapse and that
Mhm.
we can actually take that backpack and like we
Mhm.
can hold a billion of those backpacks, no problem. You can give it to me. I've got this. This is fine. Then sometimes there's that, like you mentioned that relief earlier of that, okay,
Mhm.
we can figure this out and we can do it a different way that doesn't rely on those old burdens to continue to be carried in these old
Yeah.
ways that are awesome in some contexts, but maybe not all the time.
Right. And I think one of the key pieces that I want to highlight, and I feel like this kind of came up when we did our advanced certification in deep dive coaching, we talked about that feeling of trust and safety. I think if up until now that relationship you have had with the parts has been the stern, like kind of lip service, like, yeah, 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 I'll listen to you, but you don't really listen. Like if you've been that
Yeah.
teacher when you've been running the classroom, to actually give yourself permission to apologize to your parts. If you
Yeah.
think about like, how am I going to have trust with my child? I mean, this is like in my experience with my 7 and 4-year-old, if I have done that, and I've totally done that, where I'm like, yeah, 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 I'll listen later, but I don't really, to actually go back and be willing to apologize. Like I can set my ego aside, just like the kindergartner teacher can set her ego aside with a 5-year-old and be like, listen, I'm so sorry that up until now I have not been listening to you. I really do want to listen to you. And I apologize that I haven't. I think just recognizing your part, if you haven't been doing this, you don't have to blame yourself or shame yourself or judge yourself. Again, that's just another part, but to take responsibility for it and apologize. I think I can imagine trust can be immediately fostered when you take responsibility. I'm curious what you think about that.
100%. Oh, yeah, I couldn't have said it any better. It makes me just think of like, if your interactions with other people are little chapters,
Mhm.
you can always go back and rewrite the end of the chapter.
Yeah.
Like, as if the end of the chapter is gave my kid lip service, like rolled my eyes and
Yes.
like pretty much like blamed or shamed them for like making my life so much harder when really I want the best for them. If that's the
Yeah.
end of the chapter,
Yeah.
and that's always the end of the chapter, like you can have like a whole book where that's
Yeah.
where the chapter ends. You can
Mhm.
go back in and almost change the ending to every single one of those chapters with a repair where it comes into being like, yeah, there's a part of me that was like, honestly, just wants to be my best. Like I overreacted. I was just giving lip service because there was a part of me that was, just really stressed. And I'm
Yeah.
so sorry.
Yeah.
That's not the way I really wanted to show up, but I'm
Mhm.
here to listen now. Because then
Yes.
it acknowledges, like for kids, like it acknowledges their experience that
Yeah.
you're saying like, if you picked up on me just giving you lip service, you were
Mhm.
right. Like
Mhm.
you picked up on the accurate thing. We don't go back and say, well, you know what, if you just listen better, like we don't go back and
Right.
sort of
They pick up
gaslight or
on they
manipulate. They
really
know,
pick up
right?
on it
They
100%.
know.
They
You
totally
just go
do.
back honestly and just be like, what you picked up on,
Mhm.
yes, totally, totally there. And I'm sorry
Yes.
about that. Like I kind of wish I hadn't done that.
Yeah.
And it's also modeling that like sometimes we do that. Sometimes parts of us that we don't love come
Yeah.
online and interact and we just like we're not sort of
Yeah.
blaming and shaming ourselves in front of our kids. We're not like, God, what's my problem? I'm so sorry. We're like, yeah, I
Right.
did that. And
Yeah.
I am really
I'm
sorry. And I'm
sorry.
going to try to do better.
Right.
And, you'll probably do this too. You'll probably do
Yeah.
things that you don't love. And then later on, recognize it and come back.
Mhm.
And then we just rinse and repeat. We go
Yeah.
forward with this sort of like, yeah, we're humans. And this is part of our human experience. It's like some of our parts get activated. And sometimes we
Right.
come back and just like own that.
And I think like all of what we're talking about today, it's like really doing the work of not villainizing any parts of us. And this actually reminds me of something that
Exactly.
Dr. Becky said from Becky Good Inside. Dr. Becky Good
Yes.
Inside.
Love
She
her.
she
Love
taught I love her
her.
so much. She talks about
Yeah.
like I think especially when children are young, and definitely for us when we were younger, we learned that certain parts of us were quote unquote bad. And this is just programming that we got from school, family of origin, society, that like, when you are a certain way, that's quote unquote not good. And so we grow up with
Yeah.
that paradigm. And that's why we villainize certain parts of us. And we're kind of having to reparent ourselves and understand that actually no parts of us are bad, or we don't ever have to villainize them. And what would it be like if we just changed our relationship with every part of us, even the ones that feel dark and dirty? Like, what if it's not dark and dirty? What if it's just a part of us is trying to serve us, holding a heavy backpack? Like, we could just not villainize any of it. That's kind of what was just coming up for me when I was thinking
Yeah.
about apologizing for all those times that maybe I wasn't listening. Like,
Mhm.
let's just not make that a problem either.
Yeah. No, it's just so perfect because that very sort of like broad change in your relationship to all of your parts, that's what actually makes this the most efficient way to
Mm,
get some traction and make change, as opposed to like, oh my gosh, I got to talk to all these parts. I got to do all. So it's like, no, no, no. When you just change your relationship to the parts such
yeah.
that you come from a place of calm, curiosity, and warmth,
Mm, mm,
then it's the classroom where all of a sudden the teacher and that one kid aren't warring all the time while
mm,
chaos is breaking out. It's like, no, 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 she listens, she's kind, or he listens,
mhm.
he's kind. And then everybody else just goes, oh, I know, I'll get that attention when I need it too.
Yeah. And I think that this is kind of the pathway to creating what you referred to at the beginning of the episode as a more harmonious ecosystem, just
Mhm.
changing the relationship with the parts. And I love that we got to have this conversation. I feel like we could like keep going and we're going to do it again, I'm sure. But I hope
Definitely.
you all listening to this episode enjoyed this perspective of all the emotional experiences that you have. There are so many thoughts, millions of them, and so many emotions that we experience. And I think high achievers are very ninjaful, very practiced and skilled at multitasking all of them and trying to shut down and bulldoze the harder emotions. But that is the reason that you ever go to overeating or over drinking or over ruminating. This is solving it at the root, really changing your relationship with those parts. They just want your attention. They don't want to be holding the heavy backpack. I think this has been such a good conversation just to start recognizing that. And Kristi, can you tell us all how we can hear more about you, hear if people want to come follow you, how they can do that?
Absolutely. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention if somebody wants to learn more about internal family systems, you can go to the ifsinstitute.com or the book for the lay public is called No Bad Parts by Dick Schwartz. Amazing resource for that. And all my stuff is, I keep it very simple. It's all habitsonpurpose.com. So Habits on Purpose is my podcast. Habits on Purpose for Physicians is my group program. And you can find me online at Habits on Purpose or just Kristi Angevine.
I love it, Kristi. Thank you so much for coming. This has been such a good conversation. And I will see you all next week.
Mm.
Bye.